Hey guys, welcome back. Tisha here, back to finish the chapter that I did not finish last video. My apologies. And to begin another, go ahead and do me a favor and hit the like button as we pick up where we left off, which was in chapter 4 with Irene being told she shouldn't marry her old man Glenn. Old man Glenn standing there hurt, Irene preparing to leave because he could not exalt her. Donna and Clyde took me all the way to Hurricane and dropped me off along with my now sad little hope chest and my other belongings at Aunt Rhea's. She was thrilled to see that I'd been snatched from the jaws of such terrible sin. She assured me their fervent prayers got me back, if she says so. Since school had already started in Hurricane, I enrolled in the 10th grade, 2 days behind schedule. Y'all, she was about to get married and she wasn't even in the 10th grade yet, which shows you how this cult works, where a lot of these girls don't even complete high school. Like a lot of them don't go past middle school and they're expected to get married and have babies. It's insane. On the second day of classes, I picked up a registered letter at the post office and walked 3 blocks home before opening it, shaking so hard I could hardly breathe. I tore open the envelope and read Glenn's forgiving note. Dear Irene, I know that you left against your will. I know that you do love me. I crawled to China on my knees for you. I'll meet you anywhere. I'll send you money so you can come to Salt Lake. I'll never stop loving you, Glenn. I wanted to leave right then and run to him for safety. Then I worried this was just another phase of God's testing. Somehow, I had to erase all thoughts of Glenn from my mind. I didn't return to school for my afternoon classes. Instead, I sat and cried for hours, unable to do anything else. I was so mad at God. It hurt too much to be obedient, especially since God kept allowing temptation to be thrown in my face. I wished I'd never been born, or at least that I'd never been taught this rigid gospel. Let's go with the latter part, that you never been taught the rigid gospel. Because to say you'll never be born, no, let's not wish that. At 2 a.m., I was awakened once again by pounding at the door. When I opened it this time, my brother Richard grabbed me and pushed the door wider so my mother and sister Becky could come in. Oh, here comes her mama. I don't know how to feel. Y'all, I still don't like the mama. I gotta be honest. So the fact that the mom is so like, I don't know, so involved in this situation where the mother has her own stuff to worry about, I don't know how I feel. Get your things, Irene. We're leaving right now, he ordered as he charged upstairs. I'm not going, I said, following him up to my bedroom. I want to stay here and finish school. He yanked my clothes from the closet hangers and all, looking quickly around the bare room. Where's the rest of your stuff? Rhea was up by this time, and now I heard her yelling at someone downstairs. Excuse me. When I went to see who it was, I was shocked to find Glenn was in the entryway with everyone else. He come in during all the confusion. Leave her alone. Aunt Rhea yelled at him. You're nothing but a whoremonger. Not a whoremonger. I knew that wasn't true, but I didn't dare say anything in Glenn's defense. I cowered before my aunt, afraid she would stop loving me if I crossed her. Isn't that what happens a lot of times in this situation? I didn't know what to do, go or stay. My heart ached to go and be with Glenn, to let him love and protect me. Only my fear of God and Aunt Rhea restrained me. Then it seemed God intervened. Charlotte, Verlin's wife, had been trying to fend off a miscarriage, and she just happened to be staying in Aunt Rhea's other guest room so her mother could tend to her. Now, y'all don't forget, Verlin was the one that she thought she was supposed to marry because she got a little tingly feeling, a little bolt of lightning like all of them say they get when she saw him. I suddenly got into my head that perhaps I could make the correct decision about Glenn if I knew what God's intentions might be for me otherwise. Isn't it just so ironic that the wife happens to be staying at this house and then they happen to receive guidance to go and get her just so she could come to this house. I think they wanted this interaction to happen, but we'll see. I suddenly got into my head that perhaps I could make the correct decision about Glenn if I knew what God's intentions might be for me otherwise. Driven by necessity, I entered Charlotte's dark room to ask her the burning question, point blank. I found her already awake, of course, roused by all the pounding and yelling. Does Verlin plan on marrying me? I asked her. She barely had to think. Yes, of course he does, Irene. We pray about you often. Feeling that the Lord is saving you to be a part of our family. Is he now? At that moment, after all the terrible ambivalence I'd found almost worse than either of my choices, this felt like a great relief to me. I patted her hand, thanking her for helping me clarify my agonizing decision. So she's going to now go with them and do that because she wants to now marry the other guy because she feels like she's supposed to. Oh, great. I would go with my insistent family, but I would not marry Glenn. Ironically, unbeknownst to me, Verlin was down in Mexico at around that same time, asking 16-year-old Lucy Spencer to marry him. So she's supposed to be in the family. They've been praying for her, but they're going to see Lucy. I don't know if I believe that they've been praying for you, Irene, but that's what she said, so okay. She said she agreed to marry him, but she said she was supposed to be his third wife, not his second. Though she loved him, he'd have to get a second wife before she marry him. She wants to be the third wife because a lot of them feel like the third wife is special. We know Christine Brown did. And she probably knew that he loved her so she could get away with doing that. It was a strange response, to be sure, but there was little romance and rarely any rhyme or reason to polygamy. By all appearances, I was gonna be Verlin's second wife. Little romance. Any rhyme or reason. One of you all reminded me that this is like Warren Jeffs type of situation. And it's true because a lot of times they don't get to choose. Here you have them saying, oh, there's not even love in a lot of these instances. It's just something that you're expected to do. By all appearances, I was going to be Verlin's second wife. Mother tried to calm Rhea while I packed my few things and obediently left with them for Trout Creek. I sat next to Glenn on the way home, but I rejected his advances. I even refused to hold his hand, though it hurt to be so cold to him. As we drove, Mother and Richard got right to the point. They both wanted me to marry Glenn. Richard had joined the LDS church, and he said I should join too, and then get sealed to Glenn in the Mormon temple. As far as the principle went, they both claimed that the other wives could simply be sealed to Glenn by proxy after his death, and that way I could be his only wife during our earthly lives together. That is so, the way they do this thing is so much that she's telling us that some of the other books that we've read haven't told us. But their advice came too late. I already had my answer. I knew what God was going to make me do, so I rode along in silence. Loving Glenn, but vowing to do my duty to Verlin and God. So now this is your duty to God. Okay, if you say so. When we finally stopped for breakfast, I got the opportunity to tell Glenn the truth. While the others went inside, he asked me to stay in the car to talk with him. Trying to keep my voice from breaking, I said, I can't marry you, Glenn, because God wants me to marry someone else. Who is it? He asked. Astounded, almost angry. With a lump rising in my throat, I whispered shamefully, it's my brother-in-law, Verlin. Verlin, your brother-in-law? He blurted out in disbelief. Then despairingly he asked, has he ever kissed you? No. Has he ever told you he loves you? No, I answered defensively. You'll always be the love of my life. At that, he took me in his arms, and tears came to his eyes. Please, Irene, don't let them talk you into this. You'll regret it for the rest of your life. Oh, man, she got me feeling bad for Glenn, and I didn't like the age difference with them. And now I'm over here feeling bad for Glenn because he seems to love her. Okay. I have no choice, Glenn. God wants me to do it. We clung to each other, crying. neither of us willing to let go. I would live to regret not listening to that anguished prediction of his. Turns out, when I finally heard a real premonition, I completely failed to recognize it as one. Glenn proved too great a temptation for me that fall. If I didn't get away from Trout Creek, I thought it likely I would change my mind. My brother Douglas's October wedding in Salt Lake was a good excuse to leave. Aunt Beth, another of Mother's sisters, invited me to stay with her in nearby Murray during the festivities. She was always willing to make room for me despite having her own brood of 12. 12? I'm just thinking about what that would be like as far as the bathroom. I'm not going to act like I don't have a big family, like my parents didn't have a lot of siblings and stuff like that. But the thought of that plus another addition and they're in poverty, no thank you. During my stay at Aunt Beth's, Charlotte and Verlin came up twice from Provo to see me. Or is it Provo? Provo. The first time, the three of us went to a movie. The next, we went to the park for an afternoon picnic. During these outings, he spoke no words of love or commitment to me, and certainly he never touched me. Everyone just seemed to take it for granted that I marry him. Compared to the wonderful candidness and sensitivity Glenn always showed me, this made me feel like a toddler being dragged around by her father and mother. It left me empty inside, alone, because she was doing things with Glenn that they don't do. She was experiencing what it felt like to be cared for. And even though I don't agree with the whole age thing, there was a difference there. It sounds to me like she's about to marry somebody who doesn't want her. And we're going to see her experience what it feels like to be a wife that's not really wanted. But I'm not sure. I guess we'll find out together. Let's continue. What I wanted was for Verlin to express his feelings for me, to assure me I would really be loved as a woman. I wanted a kiss, anything that might convince me this would be okay. I guess I didn't yet believe God would actually make me choose between love and obedience. If I trudged up the mountain and laid my sacrifice upon the altar, if I pulled back my knife arm and was truly willing to plunge it, maybe, just maybe, a voice would tell me it had all been nothing more than a horrible test. I held out hope that if I obeyed God by giving up Glenn's love, he would reward me with Verlin's love to take his place. Oh, girl. But neither Verlin nor God offered me any such words of love or assurance. Verlin didn't speak to me about the logistics of our getting married. When, where, by whom. I thought maybe it was because he held the priesthood and he was righteously trying to get to let God lead, make all the arrangements. As for a touch that might spur me on, I knew the believers weren't to even kiss until they were married. What did I expect from Verlin at this point? I kept quiet about my growing uneasiness. God would work things out in his wondrous way. 3 months later, my mother insisted I return with her to Trout Creek. She heard rumors I'd been seeing Verlin, and she meant for that to stop. No way do I want you in that family, she told me. The mom was right, because we've heard about the LeBarons. I don't like the mama, but she's right about that. Verlin may be nice enough, but there's insanity in that bunch. You have to think about that, Irene. I'll never accept him or allow you to marry him. See, the problem is her mom can't sit there and say certain things to her like that when she's done things herself that Irene hasn't agreed with. She married that abusive man, and that put an even bigger strain between them. So she's not going to want to listen to her. So I went home again, more confused than ever. Mother kept praising Glenn to me, reminding me of how I beat his only wife. I wouldn't have to suffer as she had. She even tried to entice me with worldly riches. Someday, she said, Glenn and I would probably inherit the whole Nelson Ranch. For his part, Glenn gave me a respectful birth. He didn't come around the house, and when I saw him at the post office, he barely talked to me. I knew it was sadness and hurt as much as kindness holding him back. It made me love him all the more. Soon, I started going over to the ranch to watch wrestling with him on television. I said we could only be friends, but he couldn't maintain his detachment with me right there on the couch beside him. He would tell me how he loved me, how he loved God too. He said he could make me happy and that God would surely want that. No one is ever happy in polygamy, he said. I had to admit it. That last part seemed true. I could see on those evenings that Glenn and I had no choice but to run off together before anyone could stop us. And then I would go home and the panic would set in. God had shown me just what I was to do. He hadn't only put Glenn off limits, he'd put me on another path altogether. What would happen if I willingly refused to go down it? One night, desperate to end the turmoil to which I'd been subjecting us both to, I agreed to elope with Glenn. What? Eli, Nevada, or is it Eli, sorry, Nevada, was just 4 hours west of us. We could get married there. Mother would gladly go along to give her consent. But I had trouble convincing Glenn I would really go through with it. I'll believe it when I see it, he said. I promised him we'd do it the day after tomorrow. The next day was my 16th birthday. I went to get the mail, and as I sorted through the stack of letters, I found one for me with Charlotte's return address in the corner. The handwriting, here we go, on it was unfamiliar. It had to be Verlin's. I just like to say that God isn't only in stuff like this, so is the enemy. So people will trick you and get what they want any type of way. Let me not even say, like, if you're a non-believer, there's good and evil. Let's say that. And evil can prevail at times. And it seems like evil is going to prevail here. Oh God, what are you doing to me now? I tore the envelope open and read the simple verse. Extra special birthday wishes, joy and smiles the whole day through. Happiness forever after, all for an extra special you. Verlin and Charlotte. Okay, that's not that big of a deal. I read it over and over. Was Verlin trying to tell me something between the lines? Did he really think I was extra special? Was he joyful and smiling because he thought I'd be his? By happiness forever after? Was he actually offering to one day pull me through the veil of death and make me a goddess with him for all eternity? Because everything is tied to him, man. Good grief. If he did not mean any of these things, why had he personally signed the note? I was plunged again into indecision. It always happens right at the time when she's going to do something. Perhaps this was another one of God's signs pointing me to Verlin. If so, I'd have to obey this time. No more wavering. As I thought it over, I became increasingly certain God made this card arrive precisely on my birthday. I mean, it is your birthday. And the very day before my reckless elopement. God made this card arrive on my birthday. It's a birthday card. I think they kind of planned that out, but okay. God was giving me this one last chance to fall in line with his will. I immediately sat down and wrote to Nelda Young, asking her to come and get me. She was someone I could depend on, someone who could help me out of my predicament with Glenn. I'll make it up to you, I told her. Love, Irene. When Glenn saw me later that day, he knew he'd been right to doubt me. The elopement was off. Good hell, he said in complete exasperation. The devil has beaten me again, believe it or not, by only one day. He just stood there staring at me, shaking his head. I was so embarrassed by this newest about face, I avoided him until Nelda came for me a couple of days later. How could I expect him to understand what I didn't understand fully myself? Meandering the way Utah winters are wont to do. What? That's what it says. February was apathetic to the fact that I was on a constant high alert for further word from Verlin and God. None came that month. There were anxious moments when I was sure time ceased to pass altogether. Otherwise, why didn't someone contact me? Verlin and Charlotte had known the quandary I was in. If it hadn't been for my busy work schedule at the Young's ranch, I might have been tempted to just go out and bury myself under the snow, never to be heard from again. Frazzled, almost beyond words, I finally got up the courage to write to Charlotte. I didn't feel I could be so forward to write directly to her husband. I basically told her I wasn't sure of how much longer I could hold out. So this is supposed to be something that God wants for you, and yet you're doing your own stuff to help it go in the time that you want it to go. I think it would be in his timing, but I'm going to leave it alone. Secretly, I decided that if this was God's will for me to marry Verlin, Verlin would grasp the need either to let me know he loved me or to do something else that would give me some hope. Well, you just put stuff into motion by writing that letter, I'm sure. If he didn't grasp it and soon, I take it as God's release and I go back to marry Glenn. I thought this a very reasonable condition to put on Verlin, whether he knew about it or not. Surely God would honor it. I was waiting for a reply when a friend from Trout Creek unexpectedly arrived at Young's Ranch early in March. Leonard Parker looked grave as he delivered a somber message. Horace's brother Slim died this morning. Do you want to go to the funeral? I most certainly did. I was dying to be back at Trout Creek. I told myself that any girl in my situation had a right to be homesick for her family. With a promise to Nella to return to the ranch in 3 days, we immediately left for home. The closer we got, the faster my heart beat. I reminded myself that Verlin never gave me one word of hope except for that little card, as I couldn't even be sure he meant that as anything more than happy birthday. Now that we were closing in on Trout Creek, on Glenn, I could have kissed Verlin for ignoring me over the previous weeks. When we arrived at Mother's house, I grabbed my suitcase and got out of the car, but I lingered by Leonard's window until he finally gave me a quizzical look. Would you mind very much doing me another favor? I began. I'd be really grateful if you drive over to Nielsen Ranch and find Glenn for me. Don't let anyone else hear you, but tell him I'm home and waiting for him. With my heart pounding in my throat, I watched a cloud of dust billow behind Leonard's car as he drove 2 miles through the mesquite and sagebrush before he disappeared into the grove of trees at Nielsen's ranch. I gotta be honest, if I was Glenn, I wouldn't want to have nothing to do with her, with that keep flipping back and forth. But he said he'll crawl on his hands and knees to China, so maybe he'll give her a chance. Would Glenn be home? Would he be too angry to come to me after the terrible way I treated him? While I watched and fretted, I saw the beige Kaiser leave the ranch. The dust blew up faster and higher than I'd ever seen it before. His car barely came to a stop in front of me before he jumped out and took me in his arms. Never mind. His kisses smothered my doubts, and his tender words of love swept them away. This was the man I really loved. After Slim's funeral, Glenn insisted on driving me all the way back to the Youngs himself. I promised him I'd give Nelda my notice immediately and have her bring me home as soon as I finished my month of work. Yeah, right. I would see him again on the 1st of April. When we parted, I felt like my old lighthearted self for the first time in months, but I guarantee you something's going to be waiting for her. March, like February, brought no correspondence from Verlin or Charlotte of any kind. This now hurt me only the tiniest bit. Mostly, it was a huge relief. I dismissed them from my mind and returned home to Glenn at the end of the month, just as I promised. As for the birthday card I'd taken as a sign from God, discerning God's voice was clearly an art I hadn't quite mastered. At long last, my mind was made up. I would marry Glenn. I settled back in Trout Creek, and we began making new plans for our wedding. Fairly late one evening, about 3 weeks after my return, Glenn and I were relaxing at Nielsen's, cozily holding hands on a brown leather couch, watching television. I just agreed to go with him the next day to take some supplies to the sheep herders on another ranch. He actually talked me into riding over there on his 2 motorcycles. With a satisfied smile, he got up and went into the kitchen for some refreshments. Just then, I heard a car, of course, in the front yard. I didn't think Glenn heard it, and somehow I knew not to bring it to his attention. I just quietly got up, opened the door, and slipped out into the warm night. 2 figures were approaching me from the dark. Verlin, I called out. The next moment, he was standing there beside me. My 10-year-old sister Irma had come with him to show him the way. When he reached me, he grabbed my hand. "I'm so glad we found you," he said. "Let's go back to your place where we can visit. Charlotte, her mom, and your mother are all waiting there for us. The moment I heard and saw Verlin, it was as if I lost all power of self-direction. He came and I was going to have to comply with God's law after all. God had not played along with my little condition. He blew right through my deadline and yet still meant to have it his way. I felt like the crime victim who finally understands that for all her spitting and scratching and name calling, she's going to be tied up and thrown into the van. Goodness grief. I couldn't go back in and face Glenn, even just to tell him goodbye. What else would I say? Another man just drove into the yard, so I'll be going now. Have a good life. How could Glenn ever forgive me or even understand? In a daze, I followed Verlin to his car. I was alert enough to notice he seemed truly happy to see me, but I hardly cared anymore. He hugged me before opening my door, but he still didn't say exactly why he come. When we got home, I sent Irma ahead of us into the house. Once we were alone, I wasted no time. What did you come for? I asked. Well, hopefully you can go back with us and, stay, maybe, forever. That's how you propose? Not exactly the romantic approach I once hoped for, but it seemed the best that Verlin could muster. After all the flip-flopping my mother saw me put Glenn through, and after all her threats and warnings about the LeBarons, I didn't want her to know I was still considering Verlin as a husband. So I hurried into the house where Aunt Rhea and Charlotte greeted me warmly. I served them tuna sandwiches and peaches as we chit-chatted until late about everything except why they had come. The next morning, she still hasn't. Wow. It's the way, look, it's the way that she just disregards Glenn that has me sitting here like, I'm not feeling you in this moment, because it's so much back and forth. And I understand she's in a cult and all that other stuff, but she clearly had feelings like this wasn't the way that she was supposed to go long before all of this. The next morning, I got up early as usual to milk our cows. Verlin met me at the corral a few minutes later, wearing a big silly grin. I wish you were milking my cows, he teased. I couldn't help but smile at his awkward attempt to be charming. Milking his cow? What? Then I heard Glenn's motorcycle powering up the dirt road from Nielsen's ranch. I hurried back toward the house, not wanting him to catch me with the man God chose for me over him. Glenn came to a stop in our yard, but kept revving his engine. He eyed Verlin's gray Chevy as I crossed over to him. He looked toward the corral and saw Verlin. Is that your damn brother-in-law? Yes, it is, I said, humiliated for what I was doing to him yet again. Then you could go to hell, the both of you, he snarled. Good for him. His Harley almost ran me down as he shot past, trailing a spume of choking dust behind him. Utterly crushed, I watched until he was out of sight. I was terrified he thought I actually wanted this. When Verlin saw Glenn leave, he came out of the corral and put an arm around me. Oh, don't feel so bad, Irene. Things will work out. Go inside now, and I'll ask your mother's permission to come with us. I don't want to take you away from here without it. If it's okay with her, we'll leave tomorrow. An hour later, I found Mother down several rough cement steps leading into the cellar we built together 2 years before. I remember how I helped her mix and pour those cement walls. The 2 dark rooms now held all of our bottled fruit and other supplies, row upon row of wooden shelves crowned with cases of jams and jellies and molasses, mayonnaise, oils, vegetables, tuna, and Spam. On one of the shelves, there was an even special case of Franco-American spaghetti just for me. I sat down on the metal army cot we sometimes used for naps or when the boys came to visit. You wanted to talk to me, Mother asked somewhat wearily. Scared and embarrassed, I decided to just blurt it out. Mother, I know you don't approve, but I'm going to marry Verlin. I'm sure she suspected this, but she started crying nonetheless. Please, Irene. I suffered so much trying to live the principle. Don't do this. You've got a chance to have a husband of your very own. You're already breaking Glenn's heart with this nonsense. Besides, Verlin will take you away to Mexico, where I'll never see you again. She finished angrily, then she started sobbing. Suddenly, I'd had enough of her sanctimony and duplicity. This was a woman who told me throughout my childhood that I had to live polygamy or else be damned. Now, just because it had been hard for her, because she failed at it, she was simply changing her mind. I don't know quite how I managed it, but somehow I remained impervious to Mother's speculations. I couldn't let her tear me down. I would live the life she'd been unable to, following in the footsteps of my faithful forefathers and foremothers who gave up everything to obey the principle. Like them, I would just square up my shoulders and march into God's celestial glory. I would do it by sharing my husband. When I gone into that cellar, I've been about 90% sure what I was going to do. When I emerged, I was 100% sure. Finally, I had endured one of God's testings, a small victory perhaps, but it gave me hope. I thought I felt a little more like a goddess already. Girl, you just getting started. Chapter 5. On the long drive to Salt Lake City, I sat in the back seat with Aunt Rhea. At some point during the trip, she took my hand and made a grand revelation. Irene, she said, the Lord has shown me in a vision that you'll be married within 8 days. I think it's so wonderful. Y'all talked about that, please. The Lord ain't show you that in no vision. Well, maybe he did. Let me shut up. How shocked I was that God had spelled this out to Aunt Rhea, but he'd only communicated to me with cryptic winks and hand signals. All my ceaseless, futile praying for some clarity, and he chose to tell Aunt Rhea not only what would happen to me, but in how many days. Why, Verlin hadn't even proposed to me. Among the group in the car, it seemed understood that we were driving all the way to get a priesthood authorization for my marriage to Verlin. Yet all Verlin actually said to me about it was that he wanted me to milk his cows. And now, here was Aunt Rhea announcing to us all that I'd been married in 8 days hence. I was humiliated. But when we arrived in Salt Lake, Verlin drove directly to my Uncle Rulon Allred's chiropractic office. This was finally a real indication Verlin was serious. Besides being my mother's brother, Uncle Rulon was the prophet leader who later formed the Fundamentalist Church, the Apostolic United Brethren, which grew quickly from a few rebels to several thousands by 1953. All of us in cars were members of this group rather than the group up at Short Creek, though we also supported them to an extent, and many of our loved ones belonged out there. Uncle Rulon was the successor of Joseph, who was the successor of Lawrence C. Woolley, who had been called by God to continue polygamy after the LDS Church finally banned the practice way back in 1904. So visiting Uncle Rulon was like visiting God himself. That's dangerous to think that way, but this is what she's saying. They decided I should stay in the car while the three of them, Verlin, Charlotte, and Aunt Rhea, went in to talk to Aunt Rulon. This was because I was underage and we come to see Aunt Rulon at his secular business. And well, we were talking about polygamy after all. It was my first intimate taste of the terrible and constant hiding that always was such a huge part of the practice of plural marriage. As childlike and angry as it made me feel, I compliantly stayed behind while the others went inside. Later, they told me what happened. In hushed tones, Verlin stated his reasons for coming. My dear uncle thereafter flatly refused Verlin's request. No, he said, she's too young to marry without her parents' consent. I've already been ordered by her father and older brother not to allow this union. I simply cannot perform the marriage under these circumstances. I suggest you be patient and let the Lord work things out. Give it a couple years. Richard apparently got to Dad, and the two of them went to Uncle Rulon and made their case against Verlin based on the LeBarons' mental instability as well as their supposed secret priesthood. I know now Uncle Rulon had high hopes for Verlin even then. He thought Verlin would redeem the LeBaron name one day, but Uncle Rulon still didn't want to be the one responsible for marrying against my family's wishes. In 2 more years, I'd be 18 and responsible for my own choices. Back out in the car after this meeting, Verlin was in a quandary. Aunt Rhea had just told us, right, that we'd marry in 8 days. Now, The reigning high priest and servant of God told us to wait 2 years. Verlin had no alternative. For the time being, he left me at Aunt Beth's and returned with Charlotte to their home in Provo. I'd gotten a reprieve. The question was, what was I to make of it? 2 days later, through the influence of a good friend, my Aunt Beth made arrangements for me to interview for a job at Sears. We agreed the experience would be good for me. If all went well, I'd make myself a little money and work toward becoming self-sufficient. While I was getting dressed for the interview, I received a most welcome phone call that had distracted me in a number of ways. Yes, Glenn, I said, I'd be glad to meet you at 1 o'clock in the Sears candy department store before my interview. I left early hoping to spend at least an hour with him. Along the way, of course, my inner voice started their familiar conflicting crossfire. After listening for a while, I finally resolved that this would have to be goodbye regardless of his intentions. Anything else, any more of the constant back and forth would be too painful. Just one glance at him undid me. We hungrily embraced. All my solemn vows to honor Verlin forgotten. Neither of us spoke of love or the future or much of anything else. I ditched my interview and we sought refuge in the movie theater. Girl, you stood up the interviewer? Oh, no. There in the dark, Glenn and I hung on for 2 more blissful hours. Later, he took me by the B&B bowling alley where a friend of his greeted us warmly and informed Glenn his order had been delivered. Glenn followed him into the office while I waited at the counter. Soon, I heard a soft, sad voice behind me. Irene, these are for you to remember me by, he said, presenting a gorgeous bouquet of yellow daffodils. In my mind, as I write this, I can still see every delicate petal pointing that exquisite, buttery trumpet at the center of every blossom. All too soon, I knew they would wither and fade away, just as Glenn would. I thanked him with tears and embrace. Leaving there, we walked along in silence for blocks, just holding hands. Then we stopped and waited for a bus that would take me out of his life forever. I felt like I was losing my best friend, that when I did lose him, just like my fresh-cut daffodils, I would lose something life-giving. Then the bus came. As it pulled up to the curb, a knot of people began descending through the rear door. We walked slowly toward the front, allowing all the other passengers to board first, while we clung to each other a minute longer. Hey, the driver shouted, if you're going with me, you better hop on. We kissed once more, knowing it would have to last us forever. With a breaking heart, I boarded the bus and took a seat by the window. After a block, I could still see my beloved standing forlornly on the corner. A week later, while I was still very much in mourning, my cousin Evelyn burst into the bedroom we shared at my Aunt Beth's and threw a letter on the bed that came from me in the day's mail. The handwriting on it made my own hand shake. It was postmarked from California. Inside, I found a single sheet of paper. When I pulled it from the envelope, my picture and a lock of my golden hair fell from its folds onto the bed. Glenn had promised to always keep these in his wallet. I didn't have to read the letter to know what his returning them meant. Sobbing like the world had come to an end, I finally got up the courage to read it. Dear Renensky, I'm in California trying to forget you. I know I never will. I want you to know one thing for sure. If things go wrong for you, now or later, I'll always be waiting for you. Love, Glenn. The regrets, the grief, the tremendous sense of loss, it all washed over me at once. I couldn't accept it. For a moment, I lost all sense of reason. I wanted to do something rash, something passionate and selfish, and without any regard for God or his precepts. If Glenn would only come to rescue me, we'd run far away where we could hide from the world and just be together. Would anyone really begrudge us that? But God would always know where I was, and he didn't approve of unbelievers. Or was there some tiny chance he might? Uncle Rulon, my mother, Aunt Ray, and Aunt Beth had all been raised in a polygamous family. Their fathers had 2 wives and 22 children. Although the women in such fundamentalist families worked every bit as hard or harder than the men, everyone revered the men as leaders. Isn't that something? It seems to be the common thing that the women do all the work and the men just get to reap the benefits of it. They were the ones who held God's priesthood. Furthermore, No one man or woman made any important decisions in his or her life without first consulting the presiding priesthood leader. When I was growing up in Murray and Salt Lake City areas, I often called Uncle Rulon's chiropractic office and asked the nurse, who happened to be one of his 7 wives, if I could speak with him. I especially needed his counsel after my mother left my dad. In addition to being our leader, Uncle Rulon was something like a father to me growing up. I recall how he would lift me into his broad shoulders and then romp and whirl around the room with me, hanging onto his blonde hair. Tall, stately, and very handsome, he was universally thought of as a godly man. On the day I received Glenn's letter returning my lock of hair, I called Uncle Rulon with a heavier than usual question pressing on me. "How's my sweet niece today?" he asked, concerned. "I'd be doing better if I could talk to you. Could you give me a few minutes of your time if I come over to your office?" "Come right over, dear," he said. "I'll have time during my lunch hour. I'm not too rushed today." I turned the cold water, I splashed it on my face, and hoped it would relieve the swelling around my puffy eyes. I didn't want Uncle Rulon to think I was still a ball baby at 16. I also didn't want a tear-stained face to make Uncle Rulon doubt my resolve to be obedient to God. Besides, God might not count my sacrifice as worthy unless I offered it without flinching. At his office, I explained my dilemma to Uncle Rulon as he took small bites of a tuna sandwich and weighed out the facts I presented to him. My voice broke several times as I expressed my love for Glenn, cataloged his wonderful attributes, and proclaimed what a good man he was. In light of all that, might there be some way I could marry Glenn and yet stay right with God? Perhaps if Glenn were willing to convert. My uncle interrupted with his most comforting voice, gently but firmly excluding the possibility that Glenn might ever be a suitable husband for me. I fought off despair as Uncle Rulon then agreed heartily with the premonition I thought I had about Verlin the first day I met him. So he said no 2 years, and now she went back and told him all of this, and now it sounds like he's about to change his mind. "There's no question Verlin is the better man, my dear," Uncle Rulon said. "If for no other reason than he was born under the covenant." His words tore at my heart. "You definitely can't let an unbeliever like Glenn stand in the way of your salvation," he savagely counseled me. Not savagely, sagely counseled me. Then, glancing quickly at his watch, he added, "I approve of your decision. You're a valiant woman. I appreciate your willingness to serve the Lord." His voice cracked when he added, "Your dear mother suffered terribly trying to live the principle. I hope you won't have as hard as a time. Whatever happens, will you promise me one thing?" I nodded. "Promise me you won't come back in 5 or 10 years asking me, 'Uncle Rulon, why did you let me do it?'" That's interesting that he said that. That's interesting that he who believes in this would say that to her. He knew something wasn't right too. He was asking me to promise I stick with it, that I never veer off the polygamous road once I started down it. It would be hard, to be sure, but I had vast stores of wisdom to fall back on and bolster me along the way. What else had all the years of lessons and talking and praying about the principle been for? I was a child of the covenant. I could do this. I had to do it. It was my duty and my birthright. Besides, I'd gone voluntarily up the mountain with my Isaac in tow. In my deepest heart, I could not believe God would ask this of me unless he meant to reward me with something just as good in the here and now. "Yes, I promise," I said. "Well," he said, rising from his chair, "tell Verlin I'd like to talk to him. See if you can find me at home this Sunday just before meeting." We all hugged. Then, squaring my shoulders, readying myself for the long march into God's celestial glory, I ran to the bus station and bought a one-way ticket to Provo. It's now been over 50 years since I've seen Glenn, but he lives on vividly in my heart. Sometimes I can even sense his presence, especially each springtime when I see his elusive form in the golden yellow daffodils. And that is the end of chapter 5. Y'all, what do you think? It's interesting to me the way that they put things on God, that's them, and the way that they say it's God's will, and they do all these things to make God's will come true. This, after all, is a cult. And something tells me that Irene is about to go through a whole bunch, because she already had to go through too much just to get to this point. What do we think about the fact that her sister and him were praying about things just to later find out that he was pursuing another girl somewhere else, but she said no, not yet? Tell me what you think down below. Until next time.